Howdy doody gals and pals, it's me Tiffany and we're back with another Sims-esque video. Today is going to be a special video because, well, Jasmine and I a ways back went through and have been trying to build some of the stuff that is in my book, The Sacred Tears, The Dance of Iris. And one of the things we wanted to do is that you've been going through and you've seen a lot of the character builds, and we've been playing with some of my characters from the story. And I wanted to take some time to actually read some of my book to you guys. No, it is not published yet. It is something that I am working towards. It is a big dream of mine, and I just like to share it with people. And we have fun with it because Jazz is a fan of it. Tyler might eventually read it. We'll see. Anyway, so The Sacred Tears Dance of Iris is a fantasy book, and I'm just gonna go ahead and jump into an audio style of reading while you can watch Jazz's amazing build of the home of Iris Stratton and some of her family members in her village, Thronesborough, which is in the kingdom of Fitzingia. So let's get started. Chapter 1. Please, Holy Father, save us. Please stop this. Iris Stratton inwardly screamed to her creator as she tore through her town of Thronesborough. A cacophony of terrorized cries, stray gunshots, and raging fires assaulted her ears. Iris dashed a hand over her eyes to clear her vision of tears. She chanced a look back at the soldier pursuing her. She didn't recognize his foreign uniform, or the simple eye-shaped design carved on his leather chest plate. He was gaining ground, firelight glinting off the metal tips of his shoes and the sword held in his hand. Get to the Holy House! I must get to the Holy House! Iris didn't know why, but she just knew her only safety was in that blessed place of worship at the town center. The closer she wove toward it, the more buildings were engulfed in flames. Holy Father, where are you? Iris screeched in terrified anger, passing by numerous fallen victims who had once been dear friends. Rounding a turn, the Holy House came into view. The large, simplistic wooden structure had yet to be touched by fire, but the surrounding blaze of the burning buildings would quickly change that. Iris slid to a stop, realizing the absurdity of her plan. She'd be trapped if she went in. She whipped her head back at the angry, frustrated yell of her assailant as he closed in on her. Go! Inside! The thoughts pushed her feet into action. Iris thrust herself through the front door. Hide! You need to hide! The Holy House consisted of one large meeting space with wooden benches placed in an amphitheater structure curved along the walls. The center of the room was left bare to make room for the worship dancers and each night's speaker. Iris ran to the far end of the building. Spying a small gap between the benches and the wall, she worked her way in between and underneath them. Smoke had already begun to pour in as the roof crackled with newly caught flames. The front door to the Holy House flung open once more as her terrorizer angrily stomped through. Smoke created a thick wall of haze, forcing him to walk slowly as he searched for Iris. Iris peeked through the small slats between the benches as the man inched forward toward her with his sword drawn. Squeezing her eyes shut and curling up on the floor under the tight gap, Iris prayed desperately. I don't want to die. Please, Holy Father, do something. The wooden structure groaned loudly and cracked as the flame-eaten ceiling began to collapse. A scream rang out but was swiftly silenced as more burning timber came crashing down. Iris shuddered as dust and smoke swirled around her. Peeking out once more, the soldier lay prone. A timber pierced through his chest. At least he went quickly. If only she could be gifted with such a fate. The door was blocked. Iris didn't think she could even escape from her wedged hiding place. Struggling to breathe, she coughed violently as her lungs fought for clean air. At least, Iris thought with morbid consolation. At least I'll be joining my family soon. Holy Father, please. Please just don't let it hurt. Darkness edged in around Iris's vision as the Holy House collapsed around her. Iris, I need you to watch Lori and Jacob today. Dan and I have to go to the market. Julie called out from the back bedroom. Iris sat on the wooden floorboards of the main room. She looked up from the game she had been playing with Lori and Jacob and laughed. Sure, no problem. I promise not to beat them too hard when they misbehave. Iris teased, ruffling her niece and nephew's blonde hair in turn. Her sister returned to the main room, smiled, and knelt down to give her kids a hug. Now you two listen to your auntie. She's in charge while we're gone, so whatever she says goes. The 6- and 4-year-old nodded happily and hugged their mom back, then hugged their dad, who stood next to his wife. Love you, kiddos. He smiled, breathing in their essence. Each parent then took a turn hugging Iris before they left. They turned away and then vanished. Julie? Iris called. Her stomach sank in dread. Julie? Julie! Julie. The whispered name escaped as consciousness tugged her awake. Memories flooded in with horrific imagery from the night before. A tear slipped through her eyelashes. My family. My home. Is everything really gone? How am I alive? Where am I? Prying open her violet blue eyes, light floated in small streams around her. Debris from the fire covered her, and the smell of charred timber permeated her skin. A ragged cough irritated her already raw throat. Could she move? Shifting positions, she slowly tested the weight of the rubble on top of her. They gave way easily. Fear flitted through her heart. Is it even safe to leave? Pushing her long reddish-brown hair out of her face as best as she could, Iris peered out, making sure she was alone. As far as she could see, she was. If they're there, don't let me be seen. Iris prayed and pushed her way out. Climbing over debris and kicking charred remains out of her way, she worked her way free from the wreckage. Standing erect, she took in the broken shell of what once was the holy house. The destruction of her home all around. Shock stilled the pain that battled to overtake her. Stepping away from the building's remnants, Iris walked in a daze. Nothing of her home of 24 years was recognizable. Absent-mindedly dusting the dirt off her pants and tunic, she took in the full extent of the damage. Fires still smoldered on the collapsed beams of buildings. Clouds of ash danced around her with each disturbing step. All you've ever known is gone. The thought twisted through her heart. Silence enveloped her. Panic bubbled up within. Why was it so quiet? She quickened her pace as she worked her way through the ruins of Thronesboro. No soldiers marched around. No enemy encampments remained. Their slaughterers had vanished as quickly as they came. Was there no one left? I'm alone. I can't be alone. It can't be just me. It can't. A terror and anguish unlike she had ever known seeped into Iris's heart and mind. The fear that had initially closed off her voice shifted to a need for sound. Hello? Iris called out to the ruins. Hello? Anyone? Hello? Staggering around debris, she cried. Please, can anyone hear me? All caution about the possible danger of remaining enemies evaporated as her desperation to see one more living soul possessed her. The weight of the answering silence pressed in, deadening her legs and numbing her thoughts. A dark hole opened up inside her. Iris stopped her search and collapsed to her knees on the ground. Everyone was gone. Only the smallest flicker of hope kept her heart beating. Maybe some of her townspeople had escaped. Perhaps they fled into the surrounding woods. Iris remained on her knees until her legs began to ache. She had to leave this place as quickly as possible. If she didn't leave now, she might never be able to. She had to move on. Already Iris felt as if it were closing in on her. Still, she had one thing left to do. She needed to find her family and bury them. The thought of seeing their lifeless forms terrified her, but they deserved a proper burial. Wandering around the town, clambering over broken items, she searched. Her confusion mounted. She couldn't find any bodies. What had they done? Did they even go as far as robbing her of a resting place to give her family, her townspeople? Maybe they had already buried them. The idea of a mass grave somewhere curled her stomach. What a hideous and disgraceful thought. One of these days, she'd somehow make it right. Her gentle town, her family, deserved that. Finally surrendering to this defeat, Iris stopped and looked down the main street of her village. Nothing left to do here. Ripping her heart from the ties of her home, she stumbled to the entrance of the town where she finally reached the road. It split off in two directions. To the right, tracks and ruts laced the road, the trail left behind by this phantom army. To the left, the path was smooth and peaceful, beckoning as a way to safety. The towns and the villages along the path to the right were in danger, and she alone could surely move faster than an army, giving her time to warn them. And yet, if some of her people had survived, they had possibly fled to the towns on the left. She had witnessed the death of her parents and brother-in-law, but she wasn't certain of the fate of the others, her sister or niece and nephew. She might yet be able to reunite with them. Taking a deep breath, she stared at the decision before her. Iris turned right. Swaying back and forth in their cramped wagon prison, the tangible hopelessness hung in the air. Children sat in a large wooden cart with metal bars around the sides and ceiling. The old tarp tied around it all kept them from looking out and prevented any prying eyes from looking in. Jody's eyes roved over each silent, terrified face around him. Roughly 40 of them were crammed together, sitting on one another's laps, scrunched up as small as they could get. Ranging in age from 2 to no more than 13, anyone outside that age group had been slaughtered back in the village. He needed to protect these kids, but how could he do that when he was only a child himself? Tears of frustration stung at the corners of his eyes. If only his big brother Sigmund were here, he'd know what to do, how to help, how to get out. They needed help. They needed the heroes from the ancient sacred texts. He thought of how Sigmund had told him the stories about those champions each night before bed. Those men and women, some of them even Jody's own age, had faced horrors such as Thronesborough experienced last night. Yet in the end, through the Holy Father, they'd always defeated their enemy.
No matter how horrible the situation becomes, you must always hold on to hope.
Sigmund's words bounced around in Jody's mind. But how could anyone find hope in the midst of so much despair and fear? Jody looked around once more, his eyes settling on the Mainfield's little boy. An idea struck him.
Jacob, sing with me?
4-year-old Jacob hid behind the dirty blonde hair that hung down in his eyes. He sniffled and looked at his feet, his head lolling lazily side to side, rocking with the movement of the cart. He wiped his nose on his sleeve but remained silent. Lori, Jacob's 6-year-old sister, scooched closer to him and wrapped her arms around him. He leaned into her. Jody shifted his attention to her.
Lori, will you sing with me?
Frightened, deep blue eyes looked up through wisps of pale blonde hair at the older boy sitting in the opposite corner of their crowded little prison. She held onto her brother more tightly, but nodded her head. Softly they began a verse from an old hymn often sung at the town's nightly worship meetings.
The path may be long and hard, but I will carry on. My goal may seem so far away, but I will carry on. I do not walk this road alone. He walks beside me as I go. His grace and aid make me strong. I will carry on.
Slowly, the rest of the children's fragile voices joined in. Soon the children in the second cart riding beside them began to sing along. The atmosphere around them began to change as courage rose up within them once more. Thwack! An iron rod came down violently on the side of their wagon from a soldier walking next to them. The younger ones screamed at the sudden sound and huddled closer to the floor.
Shut up in there! Next sound I hear from any of you will be your last!
They all looked nervously at each other, some trying to keep the others from crying. Once again, quiet settled over the little group, interrupted by sniffles and an occasional hushed sob. A small voice fearfully reached out in the silence.
Jody,
she whispered.
Are we going to die? Hush, Lori. Keep quiet. Everything will be okay.
Jody prayed to the Holy Father that he was telling Lori the truth. Chapter 2. Sweat trickled along Iris's brow and neck, causing her long hair to cling uncomfortably to her. The dry red dirt of the road dusted a new shade over her clothing and skin, mixing with the gray ash layer. As she navigated around the ruts in the road, she fought the chaos of thoughts that threatened to consume her. Tears escaped now and again. Shaking her head and breathing deeply, Iris shoved the emotions back down, refusing to let herself crumble in the wake of all the devastation. Don't you dare break down, girl. You won't make it if you do. Iris chided herself. The task ahead, that's what I must focus on. Please be safe, Jerlinx. A shudder of fear rippled through her at the thought of Thronesborough's sister village, Jerlinx. The two places had supported each other for many seasons, sharing in celebrations and carrying each other through trials and tragedies. Faces of friends, of her cousins, her aunts and uncles floated past Iris's mind's eye. Please, please be safe. The desire to pray tugged at her heart, but anger quickly strangled it. The Holy Father hadn't done anything for Thronesborough. Why should she think he would step in for Jerlinx instead? War raged inside between a longing to cry out to the Holy Father and hurting far too deep to even try. Iris's steps slowed to a stop as tears welled up in her eyes. You left me. We were a good and faithful people, and you left us. Shaking her head in an attempt to empty her mind, she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and continued walking. Her thoughts soon focused on the steady pace of her feet, a sluggish rhythm that stuck in her head like a song. The beat of her footfalls reminded her of old songs from her home, before she realized that she was humming a tune in time with their patient drumming. When Iris no longer remembered the words to the song, she made up her own, finding the most ridiculous ways to keep up with the rhyme schemes. Her eyes fixated on her feet, unable to look anywhere else. The mind-numbing rhythm put her in a semi-trance, one which she was too lazy to break out of. She was almost thankful for the temporary escape. Flitting her eyes to the sky, she followed the path of the sun, which had dipped down since she began. She knew she would reach Jerlinx in only a few more miles. Exhaustion threatened to take over. She had been walking all day and would likely not reach her destination until right around sundown. Would she come upon the enemy sometime soon? Would it be wise for her to stay along the road for much longer? A breeze swirled around and past her. The temperature began to drop as the night drew nearer. Her sweat from earlier now captured every gentle wind and chilled her skin. She rubbed her arms, then crossed them over her chest in an attempt to hold in their warmth. And me without my coat, Iris mumbled.
If it's warmth you need, I think I can be of assistance.
The deep masculine voice stopped her in her tracks. She whipped her head around in its direction. The outline of a towering male figure was barely visible against the tree line. Now she cursed her haste in leaving the village. She hadn't even brought a weapon for protection. How could she have been so stupid?
You look tired. I have a place you can rest if you'd like.
The sneer in his voice sent chills down Iris's back. She slowly backed away from him, her heart thrumming in her ears. She did her best to calm herself before she replied. She didn't want him to sense her growing fear. I'll be just fine, sir. I do not have the time to stop right now. I thank you for the offer, nonetheless. Good evening to you.
Oh, but I must insist.
He cooed as he advanced toward her.
It is still quite far from the next village.
Please, sir, mind your own business. I must be on my way, so goodbye, she stated firmly as she continued to back away.
Now, no need to get an attitude, my dear. I have made you my business.
The glint of a large knife, now unsheathed, flashed in the dusk. She couldn't deter him. Talking would accomplish nothing now. The energy of anticipation coursed through her veins. She spun on her heels and ran down the path as his heavy footsteps thundered behind her. Panic seized her heart, driving her to pump her arms and legs as fast and as hard as she could. The growing volume of each footfall warned her that he was gaining on her. She didn't want to look back, but she had to see, had to prepare for her next move. Iris glanced over her shoulder as she ran. He was almost on her. Desperate to put more distance between them, she cut to her right to dodge through the trees. The path gave him the advantage of a straight shot, but between the trees, her small frame could more readily squeeze through the tight spaces. He crashed through the undergrowth. His dogged determination terrified her. Would he chase her until she collapsed from exhaustion? She needed help, someone to rescue her. Out here, she was alone with no one to protect her. All she could do was run. The branches clawed at her arms and face. Roots and vines threatened to trip her feet. Small depressions in the earth lay set to trap her. So many obstacles were before her, but they were still worse for him. Every once in a while, he growled in frustration when he met a perplexing barrier. The distance between them grew, but her pace was slowing.
She did not have the energy to keep this up much longer. No sleep, no food, walking all day, and the trauma she had endured were taking their toll. Her initial surge of adrenaline was fading. Still, she refused to surrender. He would not have her without a fight. Casting a pleading glance to the sky, she begged for a savior. That one glance was all it took to miscalculate her next step and go crashing down the steep hillside. She tumbled head over feet, then banged on her side, tossed around between saplings and glancing over rocks. She lost count of the number of times she rolled. Will I ever stop? Down, down she went, narrowly missing the larger trees. Suddenly, she flew through the air, flung off the edge of something, and now plummeted downward. Disoriented, she tried to brace herself for impact. With a heavy thud, she bashed into the ground. Her body screamed in pain as she landed on the rocks. She had no idea where she was. Before she could investigate, her mind shut down, and everything went black.
Auntie Iris, why is the sky sad?
Lori asked as she looked out the window of her grandparents' home. What? Iris laughed at her niece's question as she played with the small girl's soft hair.
The sky, it's sad. Jody says that when water comes down, that it's crying. Why is it sad?
Lori, the sky isn't sad. It's just rain. Rain is a happy thing that makes plants grow and everything pretty.
Oh,
She responded as she looked out the window once more and thought for a minute.
so rain is a gift that the Holy Father gives us?
Exactly. How did you get so smart? Iris smiled.
Well, I am 4.
She stated proudly, lifting her chin. Well, I had no idea I was in the presence of such a brilliant person. Iris stated in mock awe. Mm-hmm. Lori replied, even though she didn't really understand some of the words Iris used. Oh, come here, you. Iris laughed and scooped Lori into her arms, tickling her. Lori squealed with delight as they both giggled gleefully. The laughter rang in her ears as Iris slowly opened her eyes. In the brief moment before her vision adjusted to the new light, she expected to see her little niece leaning over her. Her mind slowly returned to the present, and she focused on the sound. She had mistaken the trilling song of a small bird perched nearby for a child's laugh. Slowly tilting her head to the side, she got a better view of the creature. A tiny brown thing. As her eyes focused, Iris slowly put together the pieces of the last few moments. What exactly had she fallen into? Still sore from her fall, she remained lying down as she moved only her eyes and sometimes her head to take in her surroundings. She was in some kind of deep rocky pit or hole, medium-sized in both width and length. She could make out plant life circling the upper rim with a few vines creeping down the sides, none of them near long enough to reach down to her level on the floor. She really had taken quite the fall. I wonder if anything is broken, she mumbled aloud. Flexing her fingers and toes, she knew she was at least not paralyzed. She gingerly sat up. Pain radiated throughout her body from the abrupt landing, but that was to be expected. As far as she could tell, all she had managed were some nasty bruises and to tear her clothing. There was also the matter of the splitting headache that pounded with a vengeance once she stood. Placing a hand on the back of her head, she checked for any signs of bleeding. She alternated her hand between her head and her eyes, checking her sight. She was finally satisfied that she had not split her head open. How I managed that, I'll never know, she muttered in amazement. Taking a step toward the rock wall, a sudden pain surged up her left leg. Hopping on her right leg for a few steps, she leaned against the side. Inspecting her leg further, she looked at her ankle, now swollen and throbbing. But she was pretty sure that it was only sprained. She sighed and hung her head for a second as she contemplated the seriousness of this new obstacle. Her injury would make climbing out of this hole even more difficult. Recalling the brute that had gotten her into this mess, Iris paused for a good while to listen to the sounds around her. Satisfied by the prolonged lack of human noises, she refocused on her escape from the pit. Studying each side, she examined the area for the place that allowed the easiest ascent. Not too far from her was a section where the roots of the trees grew further down the sides, but they still did not quite reach her level. Even so, those roots were probably her best bet. Using the wall as a crutch, she limped over to the spot. She searched for footholds and mentally planned out her moves. She hadn't done any climbing in a long time, but maybe all those years playing in the trees would help her now. Shaking her head and smirking sarcastically, she stated aloud, "This will be fun."
She took a deep breath, shifted her weight to her right leg, and stretched out her arms. Grasping firmly onto the indentations in the rocks, she pulled herself up. Reaching a spot with a toe hold for her right foot, she once again shifted her weight, using her right leg to push her higher. She continued this difficult routine slowly as her left leg dangled uselessly to the side, occasionally bracing herself against the wall with her left knee. Her headache increased along with her fatigue. Sweat ran down her neck as her hair stuck to her face, making her long for a pair of scissors to chop it all off. She swore that she would never grow it so long again. Left hand, right hand, pull up. Right foot, push against the knee, push higher, pushing and pulling, her breath caught during a few heart-stopping moments when she slipped on a loose rock. Her hands were sore and her legs were badly scraped. Only a few more inches before she could grab onto a thick, strong root and pull herself up to the top. All she had to do was stretch her left hand out a little farther. Almost there, just push off on the tiptoes of her right foot, straining against her grip with her right hand. Reach, just a little more. Grip slipping, her foot slid out of the slot. Grab onto the root now! With the gasp and one final thrust, Iris clutched at air, but her hand connected just in time. She breathed deeply, calming herself down as she clung to the root and swayed slightly side to side. Carefully, she continued her ascent, pulling herself up and over the edge. Leaves crunched and rustled on the ground as she clawed through the dirt away from the edge. When she was satisfied that she wouldn't accidentally fall back in, Iris rolled onto her back and just lay there for a minute. Her arms and legs felt like jelly. She couldn't have moved even if she wanted to. Her heart pounded, veins pulsating. Lying still on the soft bed of leaves and staring at the top of the trees, Iris entertained the idea of sleeping right there. The smaller branches danced in the slight breeze. Since it wouldn't be wise to spend too much time in the woods, she rolled back over onto all fours and stood up. Investigating her surroundings, she let out a pleased, "Aha!" when she came across the perfect walking stick. Grabbing it, she smiled and thanked the Holy Father for this would support her as she walked with a sprained ankle. Using her right hand to shield her eyes, Iris checked the position of the sun. It was slightly higher in the sky than it had been when she first encountered the man from last night, so that meant she must have lost an entire day by now. Well, at least he won't be anywhere around here then. She sighed with relief. Plus, she must have put quite a bit of distance between them when she had careened down the hillside. Iris had fallen for what seemed like an eternity. Looking around, she tried to figure out which direction she fell from. Finding what she hoped was the right place, she trudged back up the hill. When she finally reached the top, she looked for signs of broken branches, anything to show that someone had recently passed through. Between the trees, a few last tendrils of smoke spiraled up lazily. Curiosity sparked, she cautiously made her way in that direction. Drawing closer, her suspicions were verified. The smoke came from a low-burning fire in the center of a small camp. Maybe whoever set up this camp would help her find the road. Hopeful that she might finally be headed in the right direction, she increased her pace. "Hello? Is anyone here?" she called out, trying to avoid barging into someone's living area. When she received no response, she moved in closer for a better look. One small, well-used tent was set up. Perhaps it belonged to a wanderer or some sort of hermit. Whoever they were apparently male. Undergarments hung from the lower tree branches, obviously placed there to dry. By the foot of the tree lay extra hunting arrows and a skinning knife. At the sight of the weapons, warning bells sounded in her mind. She had no idea what had happened to the man who chased her. For all she knew, this could be his camp, and she had walked right into it. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she became deathly still. She held her breath and strained her hearing, making sure he wasn't nearby. Crunching footsteps of a person lazily making their way through the leaves and underbrush crept up from a short distance. Her heart beat faster. "It's time to leave." Turning as quickly as possible, she backed out of the campsite, but she wasn't fast enough. A deep, masculine voice shot ice in her veins, and she halted in her tracks.
"Why, hello there."
Chapter 3. "Run, you fool, run!" Her mind screamed at her, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. He was coming closer. Well, if her body refused to flee, then she would just have to fight. She adjusted her hands around her walking stick to grip it more securely. She waited for him to move a little closer.
"I said, hello there. Can I help you?"
His voice told her his position. Close enough. Pivoting on her good right foot, she swung her stick with all her might. She let out a scream and involuntarily closed her eyes. Grunt! Her weapon connected with something solid. Thud! Something fell to the ground. She peeked out of one eye to look tentatively at her assailant, now face down in the dirt.
She took a hop step back from him, still standing at the ready if she needed to take another swing. The man moaned and moved slightly. This was her moment to flee, a perfect chance to escape. So what in all the lands was she doing just standing there? Was she waiting for him to get back up just to knock him down again? Was he to be her outlet so that she could finally release her pent-up rage? She clutched her weapon, aching to hit him again.
What the hell was that for?
The man shouted irritably as he crawled up to his hands and feet. Iris half-hopped back in surprise, faltering a bit. His voice sounded nothing like the stranger's from last night. Still, she maintained her hold on the stick. She hadn't just accidentally accosted some innocent hunter, had she? What were you doing last night? She stammered, searching for an appropriate question.
What?
He asked as he closely looked at her for the first time, swaying slightly as he fought to recover.
Who are you, and why did you attack me?
Just answer that question. Please.
I was here, cleaning the meat I just hunted.
He glared at her. Stand up. He glared again and rubbed the side of his head. Slowly he stood, dusting off the dirt from his forest green tunic and brown trousers, while picking a few leaves from the top of his knee-high worn leather hunting boots. The entire time he eyed the stick in her hands. Iris studied him more closely, her stomach twisting in knots. He looked about her age, mid-20s, and was taller than she was, but still shorter than her attacker. He had a leaner but solid build with short, shaggy hair and no beard. She had made a huge mistake, all because of her paranoia. "Oh no," she whispered under her breath. Her face flushed in embarrassment, and her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. She opted for a guilty grin as she slowly lowered her walking stick.
What is wrong with you?
He glowered at her in confusion. I seem to have mistaken you for someone else. She blushed more deeply and wished she could just disappear as she nervously pushed hair behind her left ear. She swallowed past the lump forming in her throat and continued. I am so very sorry for, attacking you like that. Are you all right? He stared at her for a moment longer as his brain struggled to figure out what had just happened.
You came into my camp, attacked me without looking at me, and now are taking the time to apologize?
Yes, I really am sorry. Panic and shame swirled within. I suppose I should leave you to your business. Goodbye. She quickly nodded and turned to leave. As she did, she forgot about her sprain and stepped on her left foot. Pain shot up her leg, signaling her mistake. Quickly, she tried to switch to her right foot, but her feet tangled with the walking stick, ungracefully tripping her and toppling her to the ground. Spitting out the dirt in her mouth, she let out an annoyed, "Ow." She was tired of constantly falling.
Are you okay?
The man asked from behind her. His voice proved how insane he thought her to be. She sighed, shook her head, and moved to get back to her feet. No. She sighed again. I don't know. Her voice echoed the defeat of her slumping shoulders. Grabbing her walking stick once more, Iris used it as leverage to help her stand erect. Looking ahead, she took a deep breath before mumbling over her shoulder. I am very sorry for bothering you, sir. She decided to find the road on her own. She had already caused this poor man enough problems.
Wait,
he called out in concern. Iris paused, curious as to what he could want now. He took a few cautious steps toward her.
Look, you came into my campsite for a reason, and based on your appearance and, attitude, I suppose you need some kind of help.
Nice guy. Iris thought as she turned to face him again. This time, she made sure to focus on her feet so she wouldn't end up on the ground. Really, that is very kind of you, but...
Please, at least have something to eat or maybe a drink. Just come and sit down. You're barely standing as it is.
His eyes matched the genuine concern in his words. She couldn't argue with that. Her stomach growled at the mere mention of food.
He didn't seem dangerous, and after all, she had already attacked him. Would she dare insult his hospitality as well? Releasing a sigh, she gave him a slight smile and nodded her head. The hunter grinned in response. Good. Now here, let me help you. He moved to her side and put his arm around her. She allowed herself to relax again as he helped her over to a fallen tree next to the fire pit. The last man to be this close to her was her own father. It felt strange yet wonderful to have his presence so near. She knew it was ridiculous, but that didn't stop the quickening in her heart. She wondered briefly if she'd ever find love. Shame quickly swept over her at the thought. Your home lies in ruins, and an evil army may well be on the rampage, and yet you're thinking about marriage? How stupid, how selfish can you be? Stinging with a renewed sense of self-loathing, Iris forced her thoughts onto making her way to the felled log without tripping and bringing down the man with her. You already knocked him down once. I'm sure he reached his quota for the day. As she sat down, he eyed her left foot with concern. Did you sprain it? Yes, I believe so. She smiled weakly and touched it tentatively. He frowned in concentration for a second, then stood. Hold on, I think I might have something for that. He rummaged through his travel pack for a minute and then, apparently finding what he was searching for, turned back to Iris. He held a small cloth bag about the same size as a coin sack. Opening it up, he revealed a collection of strange green leaves. He carefully grabbed one and held it up for her inspection. It's a matriarch leaf. If treated chemically and kept in the proper conditions, they have a healing quality. What kind of quality exactly? Iris eyed him suspiciously. Well, they help enhance your body's natural healing abilities so that you heal faster. Yet they really only work for minor injuries. They aren't really useful for anything serious. All right. So do I take them in a tea or just place them on my ankle? Actually, you have to chew them plain. If you add anything else to them, the effects are neutralized. Oh, I see. He handed the one he was holding over to her. She held it gently and nervously studied the plant. Look, I'm not trying to drug you or anything. She shot him a wary look. Here, I'll take a bite of it first to prove myself to you. He sighed, grabbed another identical leaf, and ate it whole. He made a couple of faces as he chewed. The taste was clearly unappetizing. He swallowed with no apparent ill effects. Iris slowly turned the leaf between her fingers. It must be good for you if it tastes awful, she mused sarcastically. Taking a deep breath, she made up her mind and stuck it into her mouth. The leaf was much tougher and chewier than she had expected, and so vile. As she continued to chew, the taste worsened. It was all she could do to keep from spitting it out. She thought she might choke for a moment, or worse yet, lose the breakfast she did not have. With her eyes watering and nose burning, she finally swallowed it all. Next time, she determined to just suffer through the sprained ankle. Here, drink this, the man directed, handing her a beat-up old tin cup. Iris greedily gulped down the water, desperate to wash the taste from her mouth. Why must what's good for you taste so horrible? She coughed after finishing her drink. The man smiled and shrugged as he took the cup from her. Who knows? Always seems to be the case, though, doesn't it? She smiled at him and watched as he put the items back in his pack. He really was rather handsome, with his dark black hair, stubble on his face from not shaving that morning, and strong, broad shoulders. She studied his features more closely. His irises were such an interesting color. The outer rims were a solid green with a mixture of light blue-green and golden flecks in the center. Even though he wasn't the biggest man she'd ever seen, he was still very fit with solid arm muscles. Just then, he looked back in her direction and caught her staring. Mortified, Iris quickly focused on her hands. She suddenly realized how awful she must look and prayed that she didn't smell. Keeping her eyes on her hands, she gathered the courage to speak to him as he went about his activities around the campsite. I want to say thank you for your kindness and generosity, Mr. She faltered as it dawned on her that she never asked for his name. Not only that, but she hadn't introduced herself either. Did her rudeness know no bounds? Yet he didn't seem too taken aback at her obvious lack of propriety. It's Darren, he smiled. Just Darren? No last name? Iris teased gently. Just Darren, no need for titles. All right, well, just Darren, she said with a laugh. I am Iris Stratton. It's a pleasure to meet you. You may also call me Just Iris, if you'd like. Very well then, Just Iris. He responded with a wink and shook her hand. It is a pleasure to meet you also. And you're welcome.
Lori lay by her brother in their little prison, the warmth stifling her. She didn't like the heat. It came from those bad men that burned down people's homes wherever they went. She wanted her mommy to come and sing their goodnight song to her. Then her mommy and daddy would say their prayers, all of them together. She wanted her daddy. If only he were here. He was big and strong. He could protect everyone from the bad men. Nothing could hurt him. She wanted her mommy and daddy to hold her and take her and Jacob back home where she would be safe. Nanny and Pop would bake cookies and tell stories. Auntie Iris would play with them. Home. She wanted to go home. Lori curled closer to the sleeping form of her little brother. Slowly, she too fell asleep. Across their prison, two voices whispered nervously in the darkness.
They're going to separate us?
12-year-old Sarah asked with rising fear.
Especially those related to each other,
Jody answered.
Are you sure?
Yes, I heard the guards talking to each other the other night. They thought we were all asleep. Sarah was quiet for a minute, taking it all in. Finally, she spoke.
When?
Right before they reach Alaster. They still want to stop at a few villages along the way.
Why?
More children to collect.
What do they want with us?
I don't know, but I'm going to try and find out. That answer scared her. If these men found out that he was listening in on them, he could get into a lot of trouble.
Jody, please. Can't we just escape?
Run for help or something. And how do we do that, Sarah? How would we get everyone out without getting caught? Kids like Jacob or Donovan would never make it. We don't even know where we are.
I know, but I just can't be separated from you.
Sarah choked back tears and grasped onto his arm. Jody was silent for a second and then wrapped his arms around her, hugging her tightly. I know, Sarah. I know. I'll try to think of something. Chapter 4. This is awkward, Iris thought as she sat in silence by the fire pit. She had gratefully eaten Darren's food, and now the plate, scraped clean, sat at her feet. He had been studying her while she ate. She could only imagine how she must have looked as she shoveled it all down. When she realized he was watching her, she made a conscious effort to slow down. Food had been her excuse for not talking earlier, but now she had no reason to stay quiet. As darkness settled in around them, Darren collected more wood for the fire, setting it up to chase away the encroaching coldness of the night. Iris hated the silence, but she didn't know what to say. Her mind was almost numb with all that had transpired so quickly. Even thinking was exhausting. Instead, she quietly continued to watch her host as he moved about. Occasionally, he paused to think and rub the side of his neck where she had hit him. Shame grew in her stomach, finally forcing her to speak first. Darren, I'm so sorry for hitting you earlier. I really am. Darren turned his attention back to her, breaking free from a troubling thought. Oh, that? Are you still worried about that? No, it's quite all right. No harm done. Well, nothing permanent, I promise. But really, the matriarch leaf I ate took care of the worst of it. Your ankle should be walkable by now as well. He smiled reassuringly. Iris gingerly put pressure on her left foot from where she sat. Well, would you look at that? She gaped in amazement at its barely present tenderness. Darren chuckled softly. Watching Iris for a second, he hesitated before asking. Exactly why did you hit me, though? Iris began to play with her own fingers. I was scared. I thought you were someone else. Darren eyed her thoughtfully and then moved a little closer to her. Iris, I don't mean to pry, but are you in trouble? She thought for a moment, assessing her situation. Was she actually safe right now? She didn't think she would ever feel safe, or at least feel like she wasn't in danger for a long time.
Taking a deep breath, she finally answered him. No, I'm fine now, I think. But she gasped as she suddenly realized how much time had been wasted here. How could she have let herself become so caught up, so lost in this reprieve of slight normalcy?
But what? What's wrong?
But many other people may not be. A sense of urgency made her stand abruptly. Darren, do you know how to get to the Central Road?
Yes, why? Iris, what's wrong?
I have to make it to the next town immediately. Could you take me to the road?
Right now? But it's already getting dark. That road can be dangerous at night.
Don't I know it? Iris scoffed under her breath. Please, Darren, this is urgent. People's lives are depending on it.
What do you mean? We're not doing anything until you tell me why people's lives are in danger. Tell me what's going on.
Darren looked at her with stubborn determination. Iris didn't want to waste any more time talking, but she realized that unless she explained herself, she would be stuck trying to find the way on her own. She would have to talk quickly. My home, my village was attacked by some strange army a few nights back. I don't know why. They killed everyone and everything, burning our town to the ground. The next morning they were gone. They are moving east along the Central Road, and all I know is that I have to beat them to the next town. I have to warn those people. I can't let them be taken. I can't let that happen again. Shaking, Iris took a deep breath. She quickly clenched her fists and tried to steady herself. Darren's stubbornness quickly melted away.
Where did you say you were from?
Thronesboro. Iris's voice quivered. Darren's eyes widened at some sudden realization.
Thronesboro. Destroyed by a mysterious contingent. Professor.
He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing.
My family. They're in danger. Uncle, what have you done?
Iris breathed in sharply as she worried for his family as well. Darren, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. What town do they live in? He shook his head, returning from some far-off place.
Alaster. They live in Alaster.
Iris blinked with confusion. That was the capital city of Fitzdengia. Wasn't it supposed to be impenetrable? It housed the royal family, after all. What did he have to fear? Iris could tell from the distant panicked look in his eyes that explaining this now wouldn't gain his cooperation. Instead, she walked over to him and placed a hand gently on his arm. That's still about 3 weeks or more away from here. They still have time, but we need to go now. We can move faster than that army since there are only 2 of us, but they already have over a day's head start. Darren, please help me. She looked into his eyes, holding his gaze. Darren nodded firmly and pulled away from her.
Right. First, help me pack up camp. Then we'll go.
His jaw set into a grim line as he quickly began his task. Iris followed his lead, picking up the stray utensils and bringing them to his pack. Not really sure where anything went, she instead turned to help take down his tent and resign herself to folding the cloth and any other clothing she came across. They soon packed everything and were ready to go. Iris shifted one of the packs to a more comfortable position on her shoulders. They didn't have much to carry overall, which would allow for them to move faster. Darren used the fire to make himself a torch and then kicked the surrounding dirt onto the little pit to put it out. The darkness deepened without that main source of light, and it took a moment for her eyes to adjust to the flicker of Darren's torch. The moon was covered by clouds, obscuring the path. Darren didn't wait for her eyes to fully adjust to this new lack of light, but instead barked out a gruff,
"Come on,"
before disappearing to the woods. Iris jogged up behind him. He wasn't easy to follow. He darted through the trees and underbrush with more ease than she could. She battled to focus, constantly juggling her attention between watching her footing and watching Darren's figure slip through the trees. How far was it from the road? If only they could reach it, then she would be able to keep up with him. Iris worried she might lose him on the way. Still, she didn't dare ask him to slow down. She wanted to get there just as badly as he did, but his desire to protect his family drove him onward with hasty determination. At least he has a chance to save them, she thought with a growing bitterness. At that moment, a small branch smacked her in the face, reminding her to do less thinking and more jogging. Just as she wondered if they would ever reach the road, they emerged through the trees with it before them. Iris briefly entertained the notion of kissing the ground, but had to keep step with Darren's increasing pace. She understood his desire to reach the next town as quickly as possible, but she knew if they expended too much energy now, they wouldn't be able to make it very far. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to surge forward and jog next to him. Darren, please, down! Iris gasped with each labored breath. Darren shook his head stiffly. No, we have to move fast. You said so yourself. There's not much time. With that, he picked up the pace even more. Panic for his family was overtaking him. She wouldn't be surprised if he soon broke into a dead run. She would have to reason with him, or else he would leave her behind. Wiping sweat from her brow, she forced herself to keep up with him. Darren, if you keep up this pace, you'll be spent before you're even a quarter of the way to Alaster. How can you protect anyone if you pass out from exhaustion? He didn't seem to be listening. He was lost within his own thoughts and fears as his pace continued to increase. She had to make him understand. Unable to think of any other options, she stuck out her foot in front of him, hooking him around his right ankle. Darren flew to the ground. Angrily, he sat back up and yelled at her. What's wrong with you? Do you think this is some kind of a game? Iris picked up the torch to make sure it wouldn't go out on the ground and took a minute to catch her breath before answering. No, I don't. And that's why we have to be smart about this. Too much is at stake just to go barreling along without any sort of a plan. So get a hold of yourself. As she snapped at him, she surprised herself with her fierceness. By the look on his face, she could tell he was surprised too. She did her best to temper her tone. Now get up and let's go, but at a more reasonable pace. She offered him her hand. He ignored it and rose on his own. Why was she so angry at him? She needed to calm down as well. She forced herself to relax her tense muscles and picked up the few items that had fallen from Darren's pack. He took them back with a glare and carefully secured them. Look, I'm sorry for tripping you. Iris spoke, attempting to appease his bruised ego. He sighed and his shoulders slumped a little. And I'm sorry for ignoring you. I should have been more considerate. His words trailed off as he looked Iris up and down. She felt uncomfortable with his sudden look of pity. Did she really look that awful? No, really, I understand. I would be the same way if it were my family. Iris broke in, helping to distract him from her pathetic appearance. But it's too late for your family, her thoughts taunted her. You couldn't save your family. You failed your family. The silence grew between the pair as they resumed walking. This time at a steady, brisk pace. Iris kept step with Darren mechanically, but her thoughts swirled in doubt, disappointment, and shame. Doubt in the future, disappointment at the past, and shame for not protecting the ones she loved. Not a single one of them. No, she had hidden like the coward she was. Oh, a wretched, worthless coward. But she wasn't hiding now. Maybe she could atone for what she had done. Atonement didn't bring people back from the dead, though. How would her new ally react if he knew the truth? She stole a glance at him. Mentally, he was miles away. If he knew, he probably would leave her behind. Who would ever bring a coward into a battle? Maybe he should just leave her behind. He would be able to travel much faster. No, he needed her. She had to give an account of what she saw. Iris shuddered. It would have to be a detailed account at that, so that the leaders of the town could identify the threat through their actions. Certain groups were known by specific actions when they waged war. Iris didn't know these signs, for she had never previously been exposed to them. She would have to reforce herself to relive every gruesome detail to make sure nothing was left out, that no clues were lost. Once again, she shuddered as the horrible images flashed through her mind. She needed a distraction. Iris cleared her throat gently and swallowed, working up the nerve to strike up a conversation. So, can you tell me about your family? The sudden break in silence caught Darren off guard. What would you like to know? Chapter 5. The torchlight danced across her face, casting a glow over her features. Her long, reddish-brown hair, although messy, reached midway down her back and framed her petite face and neckline. Dirt and grime smudges were everywhere. The corners of her mouth lifted in a faint smile, an attempt to be light-hearted as he talked. An overwhelming shadow of sadness flashed across her violet-blue eyes more than once. And yet she was truly listening to him. He wasn't used to that. This Iris girl wasn't tuning him out and just nodding numbly when appropriate. It helped talking to her like this. Describing his family distracted him from imagining thousands of horrible situations that could happen to them. So you have an older brother and sister. one sister the same age as you, and 2 younger brothers? Iris reiterated, making sure she had her facts straight.
Yes, the 2 youngest are twins, Mikkel and Trevor.
And your older brother is Devin, your oldest sister is Marguerite, and your other sister is...
Liesel.
Darren grinned slightly, impressed by her effort and her memory. Liesel. That's right. Goodness, there sure are a lot of you. Your poor parents must have been exhausted. She smiled, and Darren laughed in agreement.
4 boys in any household are never easy. Boys do tend to get into all sorts of trouble. I know we did.
She laughed as he winked at her. Well, I don't know about boys being the main issue. I mean, my sister and I, we... So did any of your sisters get married? Did your brother Devin settle down? Darren caught the glint of a tear as she hastily wiped it away.
Actually, yes, they all did. Well, Liesel is still engaged, but the wedding is taking place next season.
He studied Iris out the corner of his eye. She was exhausted, perhaps even still in shock from whatever horrors she had witnessed. She looked so fragile and scared. But she was trying to be brave. She wouldn't allow herself to slow down. That's wonderful. A wedding in fall? That will be beautiful. She smiled at him.
Yes, they're excited about it.
Would she make it to the next town? She didn't seem like the type to give up. Well, at least when they reached the safety of Geraldine, she could rest there. He, on the other hand, would have to find a quicker means of transportation. He had to beat this mysterious army to Alaster.
Please, Professor. Be wrong for once in your life.
So, who's the lucky guy? Iris gently pressed through the silence once more. Darren refocused his thoughts to the present. Your sister's fiancé? What's his name?
Oh, him. Well,
You don't remember? Iris tilted her head slightly in surprised disbelief. Darren raked his hand through his hair with a sheepish look.
Actually, no, I don't.
That's awful. Iris laughed playfully. He shrugged.
It's been a while since I've been back home.
Darren sensed where this line of questioning might lead and wasn't too eager to go there. How long is a while? Darren forced a light tone but kept his eyes forward.
5 years.
5 years? Goodness. Did you get lost or something? Iris asked, half in shock and half in jest. He shrugged again, hoping to play off the subject as a non-issue. The last thing they needed was for him to pour more turmoil and strain on their desperate situation with his answers. Not that this conversation could ever come at a good time. Still, he felt an odd connection with this Irish woman. For some reason, she might actually understand him.
You're a fool who's been alone for too long.
Darren let the silence settle around them. They walked on steadily for a while without speaking. Tactics for future possibilities spun through his thoughts. Darren's desire to know exactly what they were up against, if it was as bad as he feared, ate away at him. Still, he knew that Iris was likely traumatized, no matter how calm she might act, and he couldn't ask direct questions.
Even though I was gone for so long, I had yet to travel as far west as Thronesboro. That was actually going to be the next town I'd pass through. Iris, do you mind? Could you tell me what it was like living there?
Iris slowed her pace and subconsciously played with her fingers. Her voice lowered, but she pressed on. Thronesboro, my home. It wasn't much really to look at, I suppose. Not that it was unattended, it had its charms for sure.
Was it as pious a place as I had heard?
Iris chuckled sadly. Pious? Well, I suppose the majority of us did believe and follow the Father. No one is perfect, to be sure, but they were kind-hearted people.
Was it a small town?
Darren pushed for more specifics. Iris pressed her lips together and took a breath. I'm not sure. Perhaps 1,000 people or so. I haven't really been able to do much traveling myself, so I don't know exactly what you might call large. Darren watched her as her face twisted into hurt confusion. She bit her bottom lip and took a moment before she continued speaking. I just don't get it. Why us, Darren? Her eyes pled for an answer that made his heart shudder. We were no threat to anyone. Thronesborough had no significant role for Vithingia. We had no quarrel with any other villages or any other people groups, really. What did they have to gain? Why us? Why? Her voice hitched with emotion as she cut herself short. Iris quickly jerked her head to the side, doing her best to compose herself once more.
Iris,
Darren stopped himself. He wanted to say he didn't know why, confirm that it made no sense, console her, and somehow help her believe this would get better. But for some reason, walking next to her like this, he just couldn't bring himself to lie.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought it up. We don't have to talk about your home anymore if you prefer not.
Her shoulders lifted as she took a deep breath and then slowly exhaled. Turning her eyes back to him, she smiled weakly at Darren. It's all right, but thank you for your concern. She turned her eyes forward once more and focused on walking. Darren's thoughts flitted in a dozen different directions as he searched for topics to discuss. Maybe it would be best if he just didn't talk anymore. He glanced back over at Iris. She was shivering something fierce, and no wonder, she only had her day clothes on. She must be freezing. At least he had on a night coat, otherwise he'd feel that night breeze piercing through his skin. He had made sure to leave it out while packing up the camp.
Hold this.
Darren ordered as he passed his torch to Iris. Though cocking an eyebrow suspiciously, she obeyed. Quietly shifting his pack off his shoulder, Darren took off his nightcoat and held it out to Iris.
Here, I'm warm enough already.
She looked at it and then back at him to protest.
No, please, I insist. I'll be fine.
Darren persisted with a half smile. She smiled through quivering lips and took it gently. Iris passed the torch to Darren so that she could use both her arms to take off her own pack, put on the coat, and then put the pack back on. When she was situated again, she looked at him and smiled. Thank you.
You're welcome.
He smiled back gently. He wondered what she was thinking, her face so pensive and sad. But when she talked to him, she would force herself to smile. What had her eyes seen? What were they up against? He wanted to ask for more details, but she was clearly too hurt to discuss any of it. It really was a wonder that she could function at all. Darren thought again that Iris was still likely in shock. That was the only answer that made sense. How else could she keep herself so calm and composed? Even with all who had wronged him back in Alaster, Darren knew that he'd be a completely useless wreck if his home had fallen.
And it still might.
He shuddered at the thought. If Alaster fell, then all Vithingia would follow. But perhaps this wasn't what he thought it was. Maybe this was simply just a chance attack. Just because Thronesborough was hit didn't mean that one prophecy was beginning its fulfillment. It could just as easily be a cruel coincidence. Surely this was not the beginning of the end. He was just overreacting. Once they came into this next town, they would likely find them safe and untouched. Even so, Darren knew that Iris would still need to report this attack on Thronesborough, at least to the Lord in the nearest town. He would accompany her that far. It wasn't safe for a woman to travel long distances alone. He was thankful that they weren't much farther away from Gerling's. If he recalled correctly, this town wasn't that large, even smaller than Thronesborough.
It'd probably be more proper to call it a simple village than a town, really.
Darren mused as he remembered that he had never visited this place either. Not much that such a small place could offer in trade or supplies. A new face stood out like a glaring beacon in small villages, and the last thing he wanted or needed was to be noticed or recognized. A wooden marker sign came into view in the moonlight, now shining brightly in the clear sky. Gerling's, Iris read as she inspected the sign under the torchlight. A hopeful smile rested on her face. This village is like a second home to my people. We should be able to see it around the next bend. A breeze wafted towards them, hitting them both with a heavy scent of smoke. The hairs on the back of Darren's neck stood on end at the implications of that thick smell. Iris looked at Darren with wide, nervous eyes. They simultaneously quickened their pace. Soon they shifted from a jog to a worried run, the smell of burning wood intensifying with every step. They raced in silence, fear supplying new energy. When they reached the hill at the top of the bend that led out of the woods and into a clearing, the village of Gerling's came into view below. Or rather, what was left of it. The blood drained from Darren's face in a mix of shock and horror. The moon cast its eerie glow over the heap of smoldering buildings, some still kindling small flames, testifying to the force of the raging fire that had destroyed the town. Darren and Iris stood transfixed at the rubble. They were too late. A lump grew in his stomach. Was everyone dead? How long since the army had left? His heartbeat quickened. What if they had left behind a scout? What if they were camped on the other side of the town? This was dangerous, and they needed to proceed with caution.
No.
Iris whispered under her breath, finally breaking the silence. Darren tore his eyes from the ruins to look at Iris, her whole frame rattled in anguish. She shook her head as her face shifted between pain and anger, unwilling to accept the destruction before them.
She just lost her second home.
Darren realized in sympathetic horror. Taking a step toward her in an attempt to comfort her, Iris suddenly raced off and down into the village.
What is she doing?
Darren froze in disbelief. Coming to his senses again, he quickly chased after her. He had to stop her. It wasn't safe. Sprinting down into the valley, he quickly caught up with her just as she entered the debris. They bounded over crumbled wood and broken glass, ash kicking up with their steps. He followed her into one of the few buildings left partially standing. He had to get through to her. She was panicked, and this building wouldn't stand much longer. Darren used his torch to help him pick his way around the larger obstacles.
Iris!
He called to her, but kept his voice as low as possible.
Iris, stop! Come back!
His frustration mounted. He waited for a response, but heard only light footsteps racing from one room to the next. Rather than try and search for her, he waited by the doorway to catch her as she ran past. She appeared again after just a minute. Her bright eyes were open wide in shock, all the more mysterious against her pale face. She was scared and unaware of his presence. He grabbed her arm as she tried to run by, not even noticing him.
Iris, stop! Get a hold of yourself!
Her eyes finally focused on him. Where are they?
They're dead. Everyone's gone. We were too late.
As he talked to her, he gently led her from the creaking building. She shook her head numbly. No, where are they? The bodies, they're gone. They're all gone. What did they do with them? She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. They couldn't possibly have had time to destroy them, much less bury them. Where are the bodies? They both became quiet. He looked around them. She was right, there were no bodies. With the devastation that surrounded them, how could there be no visual proof of death? He didn't want to see those lifeless forms, and part of him was glad he couldn't. Still, it was beyond odd that no people, living dead or even wounded, had been left behind. What kind of army was this? They have to be here somewhere. Iris breathed out quietly, slowly stepping a few feet away from Darren. She peered through the moonlight and turned in a circle. They just have to be. She spun back around and faced Darren. Come on, we have to keep looking.
Iris, wait!
She didn't listen, forcing Darren to run after her yet again. Racing over debris and around crumbling buildings, Darren did his best to keep her in sight. He now understood her frustration as he had run along the central road. Having someone completely ignore you was more than enough to cause him to bristle in annoyance. If Iris were a man, he could think of a few choice words he would like to shout out. Yet crass behavior was never acceptable in the presence of a lady, even if the lady was the recklessly barreling through dangerous territory, bashing innocent strangers on the head and tripping men so that they fell flat on their faces type. And to think, he had even begun to pity her. Apparently she wasn't as exhausted as he had first thought. She had no qualms about sprinting through the village, or rather, what was left of it. Why couldn't she at least be quieter? Didn't she comprehend the danger of their situation? It would be just his luck to be saddled with a village idiot as the only surviving witness to a great threat. He stumbled over some debris, barely catching himself before falling, giving Iris time to widen the gap between them. He let a curse slip out as he picked up the pace.
Why couldn't she just slow down?
He thought angrily as she turned another corner. Ah! He let out a surprised gasp as his feet screeched to a halt before barreling into the back of Iris's sudden stone-like stance.
That could have been messy,
he thought, glancing at his torch. She probably wouldn't have appreciated being set on fire accidentally. He collected himself and turned his attention back to Iris. Moving around to her side, Darren watched as this woman came to grips with her world collapsing around her. He could almost see the chasm opening up inside her. Shame swept over Darren for any anger he had been directing toward Iris. She swayed and then slowly sat on the ground. Not knowing what else to do, Darren knelt down beside her. They sat quietly together for a while with only the slight sputtering of the torch in Darren's hand breaking the silence. As he held the torch, his arm began to ache. Darren looked for a spot among the debris to safely wedge it upright so that it didn't burn out. Once successful, he sat back next to Iris.
Is it hopeless?
Iris asked softly without turning to look at him.
Can we really do anything to stop this?
Darren stayed quiet. There were no right answers to give this fragile heart before him.
I'm such a fool.
Iris chuckled ruefully. Her silhouette trembled in the moonlight. He hurt for her, for the souls lost in these disgraceful massacres. Anger roiled within him at the injustice and worse, at his helplessness in it all.
Why have you abandoned us, Holy Father?
The hoarse whisper just escaped Iris's lips. Her trembling intensified as cries rose in her throat. The slight reflective sparkle of tears streamed down her face. She looked so alone weeping there. He couldn't stand it. Shifting in closer, he gently put his arm around her and drew her into a protective hold. The kind gesture broke through the last of Iris's walls as she burst into guttural wails of sorrow. Iris reciprocated by burying her face into Darren's chest as her screams of brokenness overtook her. Iris and Darren left Geraldin's in silence. Iris kept her eyes down, watching her feet washed in a mixture of moonlight and the second torchlight she now carried. Her emotions both drained and sustained her, fueling her desperation to not fail anyone else. Every friend she had ever made in Geraldin's, every family member was now dead. And once again, it was all her fault. She had taken too long getting there. She was too late. How many more would die because of her? She prayed that she wouldn't have to go through yet another destroyed town. Though Sonskirt, which was next along the central road, was more of the fighting kind. Maybe they could withstand a sudden onslaught. That is, if their soldiers weren't too drunk from one of those festivals. Which one was it this time of year? Midsummer Festival? End of the summer festival? Pre-fall festival? The festival of festivals? Oh, she hoped it wasn't that one. That was the worst one of them all, which was saying a lot, for Sonskirt was notorious for throwing an overabundance of festivals. Their defense was often in a drunken stupor or just reviving themselves from a hangover. But in between their festivals, Sonskirt was a wonderful ally. They loved battle and had mastered many areas of weaponry. It was no wonder they had grown so expediently. They had a high-demand trade system, making them quite prosperous, yet their entire existence sadly depended on tools made for death. War dehumanized people, taking away the soul of the man behind the armor and turning him into a mere object, as if he were a game piece for that board game Rule or Ruin. War created black and white thinking where the enemy is a monster with no conscience, where you know you're right and that's all that matters. You don't consider the fact that your enemy is the mirror of you. They were raised to believe that they were right and that you were the wrong monster. They didn't consider the fact that the man felled by their blade had created a widow, abandoned children, and broken a parent's heart. They have family just as you have family. They fight to protect their loved ones just as you do. The only thing that made them your enemy was that you had been told that they were. Who knows, as children, you might have even played together. War was a cruel monster with a terrifying power to change people forever. Iris's conscience was pricked by her self-righteous diatribe. Could she extend the same thought process over the army that had stolen her home from her? She didn't want to think of them as having their own families. She wanted them to stay soulless monsters, justifying the feelings in her heart. Truly, how could anyone claim mass murder as right in any shape or form? It wasn't. And that was the end of that.
I need a horse.
Darren fretted to himself. Iris jumped at the sudden sound of his voice. She had forgotten he was even there. What had he said? Sorry, what?
I need a horse or a transport vessel. Anything to help go faster.
Transports don't come out here yet. They can't run along the dirt road, and they haven't finished building the new path out this way. You won't find one of those until we're closer to Alaster.
I know that. It's just that we'll never make it on foot.
She knew he was angry because he was so worried. Could she blame him? She felt the same way. Still, she couldn't help but notice he had only cried out for one horse. He must not be used to company, accustomed to only looking after himself. She wondered how many of those 5 years away from home were spent in the woods. Would that classify him as a hermit? If so, he was surprisingly personable for a hermit. He was right, though. They did need to find some mode of transportation, or it would all be pointless. The sudden sound of movement in the trees ahead stilled Iris's thoughts. She glanced at Darren. He stopped walking and listened. So he had heard it too? Shoot! She had hoped it was just in her head.
Put out your torch.
Darren whispered to her. Iris cocked an eyebrow at him for a second and then followed his example, stooping down and kicking dirt onto her torch.
Be quiet. We don't want to give ourselves away until we know what's ahead,
he explained. She nodded and hoped that whatever was in front of them hadn't heard them coming. No rest for the weary, eh? She whined. Darren slowly started forward, his steps light and practically soundless. No fair. Mr. Woodsman here is practiced at stealthy maneuvers. I, on the other hand, will be lucky not to run face first into whoever is up there. I'd much rather prefer if I stayed behind while he checked to see if it was safe. I mean, really, what can I do to help in a fight if it came to that? I've never been in a fight in my whole life. Well, at least not a physical one. Maybe a scrap here or there with my sister. But never a full-blown brawl. Whatever happened to the gentleman protecting the lady? The kind-hearted man who kept a woman far from even the semblance of danger? Iris's thoughts continued to swarm through her head as they neared the sound. A part of her realized her rambling thoughts were ridiculous and just a ploy to distract herself from her rising fear. She knew that she needed to pay better attention to what was going on around her instead of allowing herself to become so distracted. And yet, what if the sound was just some animal running through the brush? Their caution could be misplaced. Wouldn't that be wonderful? It would be a nice change of pace. Iris prayed that it was nothing more than a little creature. A cute furry bunny would be nice. They were sweet and soft. No harm would come from them. Or perhaps a squirrel. They were cute too. She looked at Darren a few feet ahead of her. He was crouching lower, peering through the leaves, and had unsheathed a dagger. Her heart sank. No, not a bunny. By now, she could hear the muttered cursing of an irritated man. Well, maybe she would be able to get in a few solid punches before it all went wrong. Then again, maybe she should just let Darren do all the dirty work. He sure looked like he could handle it. It was probably best if she just followed his lead. Who knows what sort of calamity she would cause otherwise? Her most recent actions had certainly not proven fruitful. Suddenly, Darren cut to the right. He made a wide circle, then burst through the bushes. He had moved with such agility that she hadn't time to follow him. I thought the point was to not be noticed, she thought angrily. Instead of following, she stayed out of sight and moved in slowly. Why had he acted like that without the slightest bit of warning? She strained her ear as she heard more sounds, and then a harsh whisper came from someone she assumed was Darren.
Move an inch, and I'll slit your throat.
It was Darren speaking, and his tone chilled her heart. Was he about to kill someone? She moved forward and tentatively pulled back a branch. Darren stood behind a man with his dagger pressed firmly to the stranger's throat. A thin line of blood trickled down his neck. If the man even sneezed, Darren could accidentally kill him. Please, no more death. She breathed out the prayer.
Tyler here, saying thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. If not, go ahead and hit the dislike button. I'll just try not to cry myself to sleep tonight. It's fine. If you want to see more videos and help me not starve, please click subscribe. You guys rock. Much love from the Choose the Mouse team, and we'll see you next time. Peace.